J. Robert Oppenheimer's journey into the annals of history began long before his name became synonymous with the atomic bomb. Born on April 22, 1904, in New York City to a wealthy German-Jewish immigrant family, Oppenheimer was raised in an environment steeped in cultural refinement, intellectual ambition, and progressive values. His father, Julius Oppenheimer, was a successful textile importer, and his mother, Ella Friedman, a painter, introduced him early on to the arts and literature. This household did not emphasize religious orthodoxy, but rather encouraged inquiry, aesthetic appreciation, and cosmopolitanism, traits that would shape Oppenheimer's character profoundly. Oppenheimer's early education was rigorous and unorthodox by American standards. He attended the Ethical Culture Fieldston School, a progressive institution that emphasized ethical humanism and intellectual exploration over rote memorization and religious dogma. It was here that Oppenheimer developed an early passion for languages, literature, and science. A precocious child, he exhibited an insatiable curiosity and a level of introspection uncommon for his age. His voracious reading habits and natural facility with abstract thought distinguished him among his peers, though it also contributed to his social isolation during his formative years. By the time he was a teenager, Oppenheimer was already deeply immersed in classical literature, philosophy, and mineralogy. In a peculiar episode often cited by biographers, he once delivered a lecture on quantum mechanics to the New York Mineralogical Club at just 12 years old. Such episodes underscore the early maturity and intellectual ambition that marked his adolescence. However, his brilliance was not matched by physical prowess or emotional resilience. He was often described as awkward, highly strung, and emotionally fragile, characteristics that would persist into adulthood and influence his later relationships and decisions. Oppenheimer's entry into higher education began at Harvard University in 1922. He completed a 4-year undergraduate program in just 3 years, graduating summa cum laude in 1925. At Harvard, he pursued a wide array of disciplines: literature, philosophy, chemistry, and, most pivotally, physics. His interdisciplinary interests broadened his intellectual scope, fostering a mind capable of drawing connections between disparate fields. Yet it was physics, particularly theoretical physics, that ultimately captivated him. He was especially influenced by the new and evolving ideas in quantum mechanics that were transforming the scientific world. Despite his academic excellence at Harvard, Oppenheimer felt inadequately trained in experimental physics, prompting him to continue his studies at the University of Cambridge under the tutelage of J.J. Thomson at the Cavendish Laboratory. However, his time in Cambridge proved turbulent. He struggled with laboratory work, suffered a mental breakdown, and allegedly even attempted to poison a fellow student, reflecting the psychological instability that haunted him throughout his life. This period also illuminated a critical dimension of his personality, an internal conflict between emotional vulnerability and intellectual ambition. Seeking an environment better suited to his strengths, Oppenheimer transferred to the University of Göttingen in Germany, a hub for theoretical physics and home to some of the greatest minds of the era, including Max Born, who became Oppenheimer's doctoral advisor. In Göttingen, Oppenheimer flourished. He became immersed in the community of pioneering quantum physicists, collaborating and exchanging ideas with Werner Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, and Niels Bohr. It was during this period that he published several significant papers, earning a PhD at the age of 23 and cementing his place within the emerging elite of theoretical physics. Upon returning to the United States in 1929, Oppenheimer accepted joint appointments at the University of California, Berkeley, and the California Institute of Technology. He quickly built a reputation as a brilliant and charismatic lecturer, despite his idiosyncratic teaching style. His courses drew students from across disciplines, attracted by his ability to render complex concepts intelligible through poetic analogies and philosophical reflection. This role as a teacher and mentor would become one of the most fulfilling aspects of his professional life, as he inspired a generation of American physicists to pursue research in theoretical physics. Outside the classroom, Oppenheimer cultivated a distinctive persona marked by elegance, erudition, and aloofness. He spoke multiple languages fluently, including Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and German, quoted the Bhagavad Gita and Baudelaire with equal ease, and enjoyed mountaineering and horseback riding. Yet, his intellectual elitism and tendency towards self-isolation often alienated colleagues and students. This paradox of charisma and detachment made him a complex and enigmatic figure, respected and admired, yet seldom truly understood. The combination of his polymathic talents and his increasing stature in American physics positioned Oppenheimer at the crossroads of science and society at a time when global tensions were escalating. He was not merely a man of equations and theories, but a thinker deeply engaged with the moral and philosophical implications of knowledge. His early engagement with literature and ethics would later inform his response to the cataclysmic consequences of his scientific achievements, a foreshadowing of the inner conflict that would come to define his legacy. In the early 1930s, Robert Oppenheimer stood at the forefront of a burgeoning new era in physics, one defined not by the certainty of Newtonian laws, but by the strange and unpredictable behavior of subatomic particles. At the University of California, Berkeley, and the California Institute of Technology, he forged a new standard of academic excellence in theoretical physics, pushing the intellectual boundaries of his discipline into realms that many of his contemporaries had only begun to glimpse. His work was no longer about acquiring knowledge. It was about defining the future of science. Oppenheimer's dual appointment at Berkeley and Caltech placed him in a unique position to influence American physics at a critical time. He split his academic calendar between the two institutions, engaging in intensive research, delivering lectures, and mentoring young physicists. Berkeley, in particular, became the nucleus of his scientific life. There, amid the eucalyptus trees and sunlit classrooms, Oppenheimer cultivated a research group that would gain national prestige. His students, among them Robert Serber, Melba Phillips, and Hartland Snyder, would go on to play pivotal roles in both theoretical and applied physics. During this fertile period of academic productivity, Oppenheimer's focus ranged widely across the field. He delved into quantum electrodynamics, the relativistic theory of electrons, and the newly emerging ideas surrounding cosmic rays. With Snyder, he co-authored a landmark paper in 1939 that explored the gravitational collapse of massive stars, work that anticipated the modern concept of black holes. At a time when few physicists dared to cross into the domain of astrophysics, Oppenheimer's foray into the theoretical structures of the universe demonstrated both intellectual courage and visionary scope. His approach to teaching and collaboration reflected the same intense originality. Oppenheimer was known for pacing the lecture halls barefoot, his mind alight with abstract imagery, as he sketched mathematical expressions on the board with chalk-dusted hands. He challenged students not just to calculate, but to think in metaphors, to visualize the invisible. His lectures, delivered in a quiet, deliberate voice, often ended with sudden silences, gaps left not by omission but by intentional pause, inviting reflection and dialogue rather than passive absorption. Outside the classroom, Oppenheimer lived a life as eclectic as his academic pursuits. He read Dante in the original Italian, recited poetry by T.S. Eliot and John Donne from memory, and continued to study Sanskrit in order to read sacred Hindu texts in their original form. He cultivated friendships with poets, artists, and philosophers, creating an intellectual salon around himself that blurred the lines between science and the humanities. This cosmopolitan sensibility gave him a unique lens through which to interpret his scientific work, not as isolated facts, but as a deeply human endeavor. By the late 1930s, Oppenheimer had grown increasingly attuned to the political rumblings of a world on the edge of catastrophe. The rise of fascism in Europe, particularly the ascent of Hitler in Germany, alarmed him. Though never deeply religious, Oppenheimer was acutely aware of the anti-Semitism that forced many of his scientific peers to flee Europe. Some of these exiled scientists would later join him in the United States, deepening the American research community and setting the stage for international scientific collaboration that would prove crucial in the coming decade. It was during this time that Oppenheimer began to develop an interest in political activism and social justice. He aligned himself with progressive causes, attended meetings advocating for labor rights, and supported efforts to aid Spanish Republicans during the Spanish Civil War. Though never a formal member of the Communist Party, he surrounded himself with individuals who were active in leftist political circles, including his brother Frank Oppenheimer and his future wife, Catherine Kitty Puning. These associations would later haunt him, but in the moment, they reflected a sincere desire to confront the injustices he saw in the world. Meanwhile, Oppenheimer's reputation within the scientific community continued to grow. His colleagues recognized his depth of insight and the originality of his thinking. He had become a respected figure not only in theoretical physics, but also in broader scientific dialogues. Invitations to speak at international conferences increased, and he began to take on a more prominent role in shaping the future of American physics. Yet, even as his stature rose, Oppenheimer remained elusive, guarded, and emotionally reserved, a man perpetually in motion, yet distant. This phase of Oppenheimer's life also marked a period of personal transformation. His marriage to Kitty in 1940 added complexity to his already multifaceted life. A biologist and former Communist Party member, Kitty was a strong and enigmatic presence who both grounded and unsettled him. Their relationship was stormy but intellectually rich, marked by shared passions for science, literature, and radical politics. Together, they would form a bond that, while fraught with personal challenges, would survive the seismic events soon to engulf their lives. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 marked a turning point in Robert Oppenheimer's life, a transition from academic theorist to strategic leader in the most secretive and consequential scientific undertaking of the 20th century. The war's urgency forced many scientists to abandon the isolation of their laboratories and engage with geopolitical realities, and Oppenheimer was no exception. The rapidly shifting world order, driven by technological advancement and totalitarian aggression, created a context in which science and warfare became inextricably linked. That same year, a letter authored by physicist Leo Szilard and signed by Albert Einstein was delivered to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It warned of Nazi Germany's potential to develop a powerful new weapon based on nuclear fission, a process only recently discovered and scarcely understood outside elite scientific circles. The letter triggered the formation of what would eventually become the Manhattan Project, a vast, covert initiative to build an atomic bomb before the Axis powers could do the same. Initially fragmented and decentralized, the project would soon require a unifying scientific vision, something the U.S. government recognized in Oppenheimer. Though Oppenheimer lacked experience in large-scale engineering or government operations, his unmatched theoretical grasp of nuclear physics His reputation as a scientific synthesizer and his ability to communicate across disciplines made him an unexpected but logical choice for a leadership role. General Leslie Groves, the gruff and pragmatic Army engineer tasked with overseeing the bomb project, met Oppenheimer in 1942 and quickly concluded that he was the ideal candidate to direct the scientific component. Despite Oppenheimer's lack of security clearance and prior administrative experience, Groves pushed for his appointment as scientific director of the project's central laboratory. Oppenheimer embraced the responsibility with a sense of grave purpose. He was keenly aware of the stakes, not only for the war, but for the future of science itself. His first major task was to identify a suitable location for the top-secret laboratory. He settled on a remote mesa in northern New Mexico called Los Alamos, a place he had known and loved for years from horseback riding and summer retreats. The terrain was rugged and isolated, yet its vast openness offered the seclusion and scale necessary for classified scientific work. In many ways, Los Alamos became a reflection of Oppenheimer's own dual nature, intellectually intense, physically removed, and teetering between isolation and revelation. As construction began, Oppenheimer turned to recruiting the best minds in physics, chemistry, metallurgy, and engineering. He reached out to colleagues from around the country and the world, many of whom had been his students, collaborators, or competitors. Within months, Nobel laureates and young postdoctoral researchers alike were arriving in New Mexico, ready to apply their expertise to a weapon the world had never seen. Oppenheimer's charisma and authority helped build a culture of focused cooperation, and his leadership style fostered an atmosphere of both scientific openness and military discipline. The early days at Los Alamos were marked by chaos, experimentation, and improvisation. Buildings were unfinished, equipment was delayed, and the logistics of managing hundreds of scientists in secrecy were daunting. Yet under Oppenheimer's direction, the laboratory began to function with astonishing efficiency. He managed to bridge the cultural divide between theoretical physicists and practical engineers, translating abstract concepts into testable realities. His talent lay not only in intellectual insight, but in his capacity to bring together disparate elements into a coherent, goal-driven enterprise. As work progressed, the project evolved from a speculative venture into a technical reality. The discovery of plutonium's fissile properties and the refinement of uranium separation techniques allowed the team to begin designing two types of bombs: a gun-type weapon using uranium, 235, and a more complex implosion-type weapon using plutonium, 239. Each posed unique challenges, and Oppenheimer was deeply involved in solving both the scientific and organizational problems that arose. He spent long hours in conferences, laboratories, and technical reviews, rarely taking rest, often pushing himself to exhaustion. Despite this single-minded focus on weapon development, moral questions began to surface. Some scientists expressed unease about their work, wondering what consequences might follow the deployment of such a powerful device. Oppenheimer acknowledged these concerns, but remained committed to the project's goal. The belief that Nazi Germany might develop the bomb first weighed heavily on him, reinforcing his conviction that failure was not an option. His leadership was not without internal conflict, but he buried his doubts beneath a growing sense of duty to end the war. The secrecy surrounding the Manhattan Project extended into every aspect of life at Los Alamos. Families were separated from the outside world, mail was censored, and scientific publications were halted. Oppenheimer, who once thrived on intellectual exchange and philosophical discourse, now operated in a world of classification and security protocols. He adapted to the role, but the constraints took a toll. He became thinner, more withdrawn, and visibly aged during the course of the project. Yet, his resolve remained, fueled by the knowledge that history was being written under his guidance. The once quiet mesa of Los Alamos had transformed into a sprawling hive of scientific activity by the spring of 1944. Wooden buildings dotted the rugged New Mexico landscape, connected by a network of dirt roads and surrounded by barbed wire fences. Guard towers loomed at intervals, manned by military personnel tasked with protecting the most sensitive research in the world. Behind these barriers, thousands of scientists, engineers, technicians, and their families lived and worked in an atmosphere of secrecy, urgency, and purpose. It was a place where the future was being forged in real time. Robert Oppenheimer presided over this strange, insular world with an intensity that mirrored the stakes of the project itself. No longer merely a scientist, he had become a manager, diplomat, and wartime leader. He walked the laboratories with a cigarette often perched between his fingers, speaking softly but decisively, effortlessly shifting from discussions on bomb yields to questions of theoretical integrity. His presence was magnetic, and his ability to grasp and synthesize disparate fields, from metallurgy to hydrodynamics, made him indispensable. People listened when he spoke, not only because of his intellect, but because he radiated a kind of moral gravity. Daily life at Los Alamos was paradoxical. On one hand, it resembled an elite scientific commune. Lectures by Nobel laureates, chalkboards filled with equations, and animated late-night debates in mess halls. On the other hand, it was a military installation with layers of surveillance and restrictions. Scientists wore identification badges and were assigned code names. Children played near barbed wire fences, unaware of their proximity to history's most devastating weapon. The community lived under a fog of isolation, unable to contact relatives or discuss their work with outsiders, yet bound together by the common, unspoken knowledge of what they were building. The scientific challenges were monumental. The implosion method for the plutonium bomb, an innovation driven by the unpredictable behavior of the element, required a level of precision never before attempted. The team had to devise high-speed detonators, develop symmetrical explosive lenses, and model the behavior of nuclear materials under extreme conditions. Entire sub-teams worked around the clock, developing equations and testing theories under strict deadlines. Theoretical predictions had to be translated into physical components, and the margin for error was razor-thin. To support this effort, Oppenheimer established an organizational structure that was both hierarchical and flexible. He understood that open communication between departments was essential, even within the constraints of secrecy. He hosted regular colloquia where scientists could present problems and solutions across disciplines, fostering collaboration rather than competition. This culture of openness, rare in military projects, was key to maintaining morale and accelerating progress. Scientists from vastly different backgrounds found themselves united under a common, if haunting, purpose. Amid this progress, personal tensions brewed. The high-pressure environment, combined with the isolation of the site, created stress and emotional strain. Marriages were tested, tempers frayed, and friendships sometimes dissolved under the weight of exhaustion and secrecy. Oppenheimer himself was not immune. His relationship with his wife, Kitty, became increasingly strained as she struggled with a claustrophobic life at the lab and bouts of depression. Despite these personal difficulties, Oppenheimer continued to lead with unrelenting focus, masking his own doubts behind a veil of calm resolve. The intensity of the work also took a physical toll. Scientists who had once taught in university lecture halls now worked through nights in dimly lit labs, exposed to toxic chemicals and radioactive materials with only rudimentary safety protocols. Accidents occurred. One of the most tragic incidents involved physicist Harry Daghlian, who would later die from radiation poisoning after a criticality accident. These moments cast long shadows over the project, forcing researchers to confront the tangible consequences of their work long before the bomb was ever dropped. By early 1945, the pieces of the bomb were coming together. Los Alamos had become not just a laboratory, but a production site, where theory and practice collided under tight schedules and constant oversight. Components were tested, retested, and shipped to remote testing grounds in the New Mexico desert. The first full-scale detonation, codenamed Trinity, was planned for the summer, and preparations dominated every aspect of life. Instrumentation towers were built, blast gauges installed, and bunkers constructed. The desert, once an untouched expanse, was now the stage for an unprecedented human experiment. Throughout this period, Oppenheimer's demeanor grew more subdued. Though outwardly composed, he began to withdraw emotionally, speaking less of poetry and more of practical matters. He spent long hours alone in his office, often staring out across the mesa in silent contemplation. Those closest to him sensed a shift, not of confidence, but of weight. It was clear that he understood the magnitude of what they were about to unleash. Though he rarely voiced moral concerns publicly, his silences spoke volumes. In the early morning hours of July 16, 1945, a heavy stillness settled over the desert plains of southern New Mexico. The Jornada del Muerto, Journey of the Dead Man, a barren stretch of scorched earth, had been chosen months earlier as the site for an event that would alter the course of human history. Here at the Trinity site, the scientists of the Manhattan Project prepared to test the first nuclear bomb. After years of clandestine work, theoretical speculation, and technical precision, the moment of reckoning had arrived. The atmosphere leading up to the test was tense and surreal. A skeletal steel tower rose 100 feet above the flat desert floor, cradling a spherical plutonium bomb known only by its codename, the Gadget. Nearby, bunkers and observation shelters were filled with scientists, engineers, and military officials, all awaiting the detonation. Wires ran across the landscape like veins, feeding into recording devices, blast sensors, and high-speed cameras. Every instrument had a role. Every reading would be vital. But no calculation, no model, could fully prepare them for what was about to unfold. Robert Oppenheimer arrived at the Trinity site days before the scheduled detonation, his face drawn and shadowed by weeks of sleepless anticipation. He oversaw the final preparations with a quiet intensity, reviewing checklists, inspecting safety measures, and coordinating with his most trusted colleagues. Though surrounded by a cadre of scientists, he spent long moments alone, staring out across the expanse of sagebrush and rock. The desert had long been a place of solitude for him. Now it stood as the threshold of a new age. The initial test date was delayed by bad weather. Storm clouds gathered ominously, and lightning threatened the sensitive electronics installed throughout the test site. Anxiety grew in the control bunkers, where chalkboards bore final reminders, and tension twisted into near silence. Radios crackled with brief updates as the countdown was rescheduled and then rescheduled again. Oppenheimer remained composed, yet those around him noticed his fingers twitching restlessly, a physical echo of the gravity hanging over them all. At precisely 5:29 a.m., with the sky still inked in pre-dawn blue, the bomb detonated. For a fraction of a second, the world was engulfed in white light, brighter than the sun, sharper than lightning, and utterly alien in its magnitude. A massive fireball rose into the sky, expanding with terrible elegance. It cast shadows across the desert floor, illuminated mountains 40 miles away, and ignited the steel tower in an instant. The blast followed moments later, a deafening shockwave that shattered glass 120 miles away and scorched the ground to glassy, radioactive sand. From his observation point over 5 miles from ground zero, Oppenheimer stood transfixed. As the light faded and the mushroom cloud climbed into the heavens, a line of verse surfaced in his mind, unbidden and haunting. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. It came from the Bhagavad Gita, a sacred Hindu text he had studied years earlier. In that moment, ancient scripture and modern science fused into a singular, irreversible truth. What had been theory was now reality, awful and awe-inspiring. The immediate response among the observers varied wildly. Some shouted in amazement. Others stood in stunned silence. A few laughed nervously, a release of unbearable tension. The scientists recorded data with trembling hands, noting the success of the implosion mechanism, the yield of the bomb, the patterns of radiation. Yet as the dust began to settle, a deeper silence took hold. The magnitude of their success was eclipsed by the magnitude of its implications. The bomb had worked, but what had they unleashed? In the days that followed, reports were compiled, photographs developed, and data analyzed. Oppenheimer traveled back to Los Alamos, his mind now preoccupied not with engineering but with ethics. The Trinity test had been, in technical terms, a triumph. But the question that now loomed over every conversation, every chalkboard equation, was no longer how, but why? And what next? For many, the glow of scientific achievement had begun to dim, replaced by a creeping awareness that the world they had known no longer existed. News of the test was kept secret from the public. Even most members of the military and government were unaware of what had happened in the New Mexico desert. But within the highest levels of leadership, the success of the Trinity test reshaped strategy overnight. President Harry S. Truman, newly briefed on the Manhattan Project after Roosevelt's death in April, now had a weapon of unprecedented destructive power at his disposal. Plans accelerated. Targets were discussed. The countdown to Hiroshima had begun. On the morning of August 6th, 1945, the Japanese city of Hiroshima awoke under a clear sky. Just past 8:15 a.m., the peace was shattered by a brilliant flash of light, followed by a soundless, searing wave of destruction. In an instant, over 70,000 people perished. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Concrete buildings crumbled like paper, and firestorms consumed what remained. The atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, had detonated with a force never before experienced in warfare. From 30,000 feet above, the crew of the Enola Gay saw a giant cloud rising into the sky, spiraling upward like a malevolent blossom. Thousands of miles away, Robert Oppenheimer learned of the bombing not with satisfaction, but with a grim sobriety. Though he had been central to the creation of the bomb, its deployment was now in the hands of the military and the president. When official word of Hiroshima's destruction reached Los Alamos, the reactions were mixed, cheers from some, somber quiet from others. Oppenheimer said little. His face, once animated with the challenge of scientific endeavor, was now somber and tight. He understood that the world had turned a corner that morning, one that could not be retraced. News bulletins filtered through the press with controlled enthusiasm. The U.S. government released statements emphasizing the military necessity of the bombing and its role in hastening Japan's surrender. But the details, charred bodies, radiation sickness, survivors with horrific injuries, were slow to emerge. In scientific circles, however, rumors and preliminary reports painted a far more devastating picture. Hiroshima had not simply been a tactical success, it had been a human catastrophe. And Oppenheimer, despite not being present at the bombing, could feel its shadow pressing on him. 3 days later, a second bomb, this time a more complex Fat Man, developed from the plutonium implosion design tested at Trinity, was dropped on Nagasaki. The destruction was swift and immense. Oppenheimer, who had once referred to the bomb as a technical solution, now struggled to reconcile its scale with its necessity. He was no pacifist by instinct. He had supported intervention in World War II and feared the threat of Nazi advancement. But with the Axis defeated in Europe and Japan's situation growing increasingly desperate, the justification for atomic force felt less certain. Privately, Oppenheimer began to express regret. He spoke less of scientific achievement and more of consequences. In letters to colleagues, he admitted that he felt blood on his hands. His demeanor shifted from the intense, cerebral leader of Los Alamos to a quieter, more withdrawn figure, consumed by reflection. In his conversations with fellow physicists, he no longer emphasized victory, but morality. The man who had once summoned the powers of the universe now found himself haunted by what they had wrought. In Washington, Oppenheimer met with senior officials, including President Truman. During one especially fraught meeting, he famously told the president, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, offended and perhaps unsettled by the scientist's guilt, later dismissed Oppenheimer as a crybaby scientist. The encounter made clear the widening chasm between scientific leadership and political authority. Oppenheimer had expected gravity, perhaps even reverence. What he received instead was a cold assertion that decisions about war and peace were not the concern of physicists. The public, however, saw little of Oppenheimer's internal crisis. In the press, he remained a brilliant mind behind the bomb, a national hero in the eyes of many. Magazines praised him as a modern Prometheus, a man who had brought fire to mankind. Yet within academic and military communities, discussions were growing more complex. The question was no longer whether the bomb had worked, but what its continued presence in global affairs would mean. As nations scrambled to understand nuclear technology, Oppenheimer began to worry that the world was rushing into an arms race with no end in sight. The scientific community, too, began to fracture. Some believed the bomb's use was justified and that its deterrent power would prevent future wars. Others, including many of Oppenheimer's closest colleagues, believed that scientists now had a duty to control what they had unleashed. Conferences and letters debated the role of science in policy and how, if at all, the spread of nuclear weapons could be curtailed. These debates would shape the coming decades, but they also deeply influenced Oppenheimer's evolving worldview. His days at Los Alamos were now numbered. With the bomb built and used, the laboratory was being demobilized and restructured under new military oversight. Oppenheimer, no longer essential to its operation, turned his attention elsewhere. He accepted a position as chairman of the General Advisory Committee to the newly formed Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, a civilian body tasked with overseeing nuclear policy. It was a role he hoped would give him a voice in guiding the future of atomic science, away from weapons and toward peace. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Robert Oppenheimer stepped into a new arena. No longer cloaked in laboratory shadows, he emerged into the daylight of political influence. Appointed chairman of the General Advisory Committee, GAC, to the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, he now occupied a pivotal role in shaping the nation's post-war nuclear policy. The position was advisory in name, but critical in influence, granting Oppenheimer a platform from which to advocate for international controls on atomic energy and the ethical stewardship of scientific innovation. No longer just a scientist, he had become a statesman of the atom. His office in Washington lacked the raw energy of Los Alamos, but it buzzed with the gravity of policy and diplomacy. Oppenheimer spoke in measured tones at commission meetings, flanked by other renowned physicists and bureaucrats. His views were nuanced and often at odds with prevailing hawkish sentiments. He believed that the United States, as the first and only nuclear power at the time, bore a unique responsibility, not to dominate with a bomb, but to prevent its uncontrolled proliferation. He warned against the development of newer, more destructive weapons, advocating instead for transparency, restraint, and international cooperation. These positions quickly earned him enemies. As Cold War tensions escalated, political leaders began to see the world through a binary lens of loyalty and threat. In that climate, Oppenheimer's reluctance to support an aggressive nuclear buildup was seen not as prudence, but as weakness, if not outright subversion. His calls for diplomacy in dealing with the Soviet Union clashed with the emerging doctrine of containment. He cautioned against the weaponization of fear, yet that fear had already become a political tool too powerful to resist. The greatest test of his influence came in 1949, when the Soviet Union shocked the world by detonating its first atomic bomb. The reaction in the United States was swift and panicked. Within weeks, voices in Washington began calling for the development of a new, even more devastating weapon, the hydrogen bomb. This device, based on nuclear fusion rather than fission, promised destruction on a scale exponentially greater than that of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was not just a weapon, it was a statement of dominance. When the AEC sought the GAC's opinion on the hydrogen bomb proposal, Oppenheimer and his colleagues responded with caution, even disapproval. Their October report stated that the weapon was unnecessary, morally questionable, and unlikely to be a real deterrent. Oppenheimer, in particular, questioned whether any technical achievement could justify such a leap in destructive power. He feared that it would escalate the arms race beyond control, pushing humanity to the brink. His stance was not one of naivete, but of deeply considered conviction. His opposition to the hydrogen bomb, however, was perceived by many as dangerous idealism. Edward Teller, once Oppenheimer's colleague, now emerged as his rival and chief proponent of the H-bomb. The divide between the two men, once bound by scientific collaboration, grew into a philosophical chasm. Teller believed in pursuing the utmost power as a deterrent. Oppenheimer saw unchecked power as an existential threat. The fallout from their clash would define nuclear discourse for years to come. In public, Oppenheimer maintained a calm exterior. He lectured at universities, wrote articles on science and society, and advised presidents. But behind closed doors, he was increasingly isolated. Whispers about his political leanings, especially his past associations with leftist circles in the 1930s, began to circulate with new urgency. In the paranoid atmosphere of the early 1950s, these whispers became accusations. Loyalty boards scrutinized his security clearance, looking for signs of disloyalty or ideological impurity. As McCarthyism swept across the United States, Oppenheimer became a prime target. Not because he had committed any crime, but because he had dared to question the orthodoxy of American militarism. His intelligence, once celebrated, was now viewed with suspicion. His advocacy for international atomic control, once praised, was now seen as naive or even traitorous. The same man who had built the bomb was now being portrayed as a threat to national security. Throughout this period, Oppenheimer continued to speak, but his words were met with increasing resistance. Where once he had shaped policy, now he found himself sidelined. The government had changed, and so had the country. Science was no longer viewed as a beacon of truth, but as a potential weapon in the ideological battle against communism. Oppenheimer, with his poetic inclinations and philosophical doubts, no longer fit the mold of the post-war American hero. By the early 1950s, the once unshakable aura surrounding Robert Oppenheimer had begun to fray. The man who had stood at the forefront of the most powerful scientific endeavor in modern history now found himself encircled by suspicion. To some in Washington, he had ceased to be a symbol of American ingenuity and had become instead a liability. A man of brilliance, yes, but also of inconvenient conscience. The country had entered a new phase, one not governed by moral reflection, but by ideological warfare. In such a climate, Oppenheimer's introspective skepticism was seen less as wisdom and more as betrayal. The machinery of scrutiny moved quietly at first. Files were pulled, testimonies were reviewed, old acquaintances were interviewed. Oppenheimer's past, his political affiliations in the 1930s, his connections with Communist Party members, his outspoken stance against the hydrogen bomb, was laid out not as history, but as evidence. What had once been tolerated in times of necessity now took on a sinister hue under the fluorescence of Cold War anxiety. In 1953, the assault became formal. Lewis Strauss, a powerful member of the Atomic Energy Commission and longtime adversary of Oppenheimer, initiated efforts to revoke the scientist's security clearance. Strauss, driven by both ideological zeal and personal vendetta, viewed Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb and his influence on nuclear policy as dangerous obstacles. Under his guidance, the AEC assembled a case, thin in proof but heavy with insinuation. The following year, Oppenheimer was summoned to a security hearing that would last nearly a month. Held in a closed room without public transparency, the proceedings unfolded like a courtroom drama with high stakes and invisible boundaries. Oppenheimer was not charged with any crime, but the hearing's tone was unmistakably prosecutorial. He sat across from panels of lawyers and government officials, subjected to hours of cross-examination. His career, his loyalty, and his character were placed under the microscope. Witnesses were brought in, some friends, others former colleagues. Their testimonies varied. Some defended him passionately, while others, like Edward Teller, offered damning yet equivocal statements. Teller admitted he did not believe Oppenheimer to be disloyal, but declared he would feel more secure if the nation's nuclear secrets were entrusted to someone else. That single sentence echoed through the chambers like a verdict. Oppenheimer's responses during the hearings were thoughtful, but often subdued. He appeared weary, his voice at times faltering under the weight of repeated questioning. Though he denied ever having been a communist, he acknowledged that he had, in his youth, been sympathetic to left-wing causes. He admitted to past associations, but insisted they had not influenced his work or allegiance to the United States. Still, in the political climate of the day, nuance was no defense. The hearing culminated in a decision that was both unsurprising and devastating. Oppenheimer's security clearance was revoked. The judgment declared him a security risk, not for any proven act of treason, but for perceived vulnerability to influence, for his opposition to dominant military policy, and for what the board called a lack of candor. It was a public unmaking, though the hearing itself remained classified at first. His fall was not due to failure in science, but in politics. News of the decision, once made public, rippled through academic and political communities. Many were shocked, some outraged. To those who had respected Oppenheimer, it seemed an act of institutional cowardice, a warning to others who might dare to challenge authority. To his detractors, It was a triumph of national security over sentiment. The scientific world watched as one of its giants was symbolically exiled from the corridors of power he had once helped shape. In the years that followed, Oppenheimer did not return to government service. The revocation of his clearance effectively ended his political influence. He withdrew to quieter pursuits, teaching, writing, and reflecting. Though still a public figure, he no longer occupied the center of scientific or political discourse. His image, once celebrated on magazine covers, faded into something more tragic. The face of a man undone not by enemies abroad, but by suspicion at home. After the hearings, Robert Oppenheimer's world became smaller. The grand stages of Washington and Los Alamos faded behind him, replaced by the quiet landscapes of the Virgin Islands and the secluded halls of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. There, in the academic sanctuary where he had once nurtured young minds and hosted brilliant peers, he now walked more slowly, more thoughtfully. His influence was diminished, but his intellect remained intact, sharp as ever, though softened by disillusionment. He continued to serve as director of the Institute until 1966, though his public engagements had waned. Oppenheimer rarely spoke of the security hearings. He regarded them not with open resentment, but with a kind of stoic resignation. Friends and colleagues noted how he had grown quieter over the years. The once fiery orator had become contemplative, even cryptic. There was a profound shift in his demeanor, a sense that the man who had helped harness the energy of the universe was now preoccupied with inner reckonings. Much of his time was spent reading. He returned to the texts that had inspired him in his youth: Sanskrit scriptures, classical literature, philosophy. The Bhagavad Gita remained particularly resonant, not for its invocation of destruction, but for its contemplation of duty and consequence. In those verses, he sought not absolution, but understanding. The battles within Arjuna mirrored his own. Choices made under the weight of responsibility, torn between action and regret. He also wrote, though less prolifically than before. His essays were dense, abstract, often blending physics with philosophical inquiry. He seemed less interested in advocating for policy and more intent on exploring the moral territory of science. In his writings, there were no easy conclusions. He questioned whether humanity was equipped to wield the power it had unleashed and whether scientists could ever fully divorce themselves from the consequences of their discoveries. Despite his retreat from public life, invitations occasionally reached him from abroad. In Europe, where the political climate was less charged, Oppenheimer found greater sympathy. He traveled to conferences in the Netherlands, France, and Switzerland, where he was treated with the respect he had once known at home. These trips brought brief relief, a reminder that his legacy had not been entirely buried under the weight of domestic suspicion. His personal life, however, remained complicated. The wounds of his public humiliation lingered. His relationship with his wife, Kitty, had grown strained. Once bound by shared idealism, they now lived together in a state of mutual withdrawal. Kitty, embittered by what she saw as her husband's passivity during his downfall, turned increasingly to alcohol. Their home, once lively with conversation and guests, grew quiet and somber. Oppenheimer found solace in the sea. On the island of St. John in the Virgin Islands, he kept a modest house, far from the institutions that had once defined him. There, he would sail alone or with a few close companions, watching the sky change over the water. The rhythm of the ocean offered a kind of peace that the world of politics and science never had. He spoke little during these excursions, content to let the wind and tide carry him in silence. Occasionally, younger scientists and students visited him, drawn by his reputation and mystique. They found a man both brilliant and enigmatic, someone who had once stood at the center of history and now seemed to drift from it. Oppenheimer never discouraged their curiosity, but he rarely encouraged it either. He offered them thoughtful conversation, but no answers. He knew better than most that answers, especially to the deepest questions, often eluded even the brightest minds. Throughout these years, he was neither fully forgotten nor fully restored. Articles still appeared about him, some revisiting the hearings, others examining his legacy. He read them without comment. He had come to accept that history would judge him according to its own standards. The weight of legacy was no longer his to bear or shape. Instead, he focused on what remained within his reach: thought, reflection, and the pursuit of personal clarity. Robert Oppenheimer died on February 18, 1967, in Princeton, New Jersey. His passing marked the quiet end of a life that had once vibrated with the force of revolution, scientific, political, and moral. The world he left behind was forever changed by the choices he had helped set in motion. Yet in his final days, Oppenheimer did not seek monuments or forgiveness. What remained was a complex legacy, refracted through the lens of history and reshaped by the conscience of a changing world. In the years following his death, historians, scientists, and biographers began to piece together the full arc of his journey. No longer confined to caricature, the genius turned pariah, the Prometheus punished, Oppenheimer emerged as a deeply human figure. He had lived at the intersection of discovery and devastation, of brilliance and doubt. The narratives that unfolded were rich with contradiction, and it was in those contradictions that his legacy became most vivid. Among the scientific community, Oppenheimer was increasingly remembered not just for the bomb, but for his intellect and influence in theoretical physics. His early contributions to quantum mechanics and stellar theory continue to be recognized and taught long after his political relevance had dimmed. The very language of modern physics still echoed with his insights. For younger generations of physicists, he served as a reminder of science's potential and its peril. In academic circles, Oppenheimer's fall was studied not only as a case of political injustice, but as a turning point in the relationship between science and government. His security hearing, once regarded as an isolated episode of the Red Scare, came to symbolize the fragility of intellectual independence in times of fear. Universities and institutions cited his case as a cautionary tale, embedding it into the ethical education of future scientists and policymakers. Over time, the wounds left by the Cold War began to heal, and so too did official attitudes toward Oppenheimer. In 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson awarded him the Enrico Fermi Award, a gesture of partial rehabilitation. Though Oppenheimer accepted with characteristic restraint, the moment was symbolic, an acknowledgement, if not a full exoneration, from the very establishment that had once cast him aside. He stood beside the president, thinner and older, his voice still carrying the ghost of lost authority. In popular culture, Oppenheimer's image evolved as well. Playwrights, filmmakers, and novelists returned to his story, drawn to its tragedy and grandeur. He appeared in biographies, documentaries, and dramatizations, not as a distant relic of history, but as a lens through which to examine the 20th century's deepest dilemmas. The line he famously quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," resonated far beyond its original context, etched into the collective memory as a symbol of knowledge turned ambivalent. Outside the halls of academia and the glow of the screen, his name was quietly spoken in conversations about scientific responsibility. Debates over emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, cyber warfare, often circled back to the question of Oppenheimer. How should a scientist act when their discovery holds the power to reshape or destroy the world? His story became a benchmark for grappling with these dilemmas, not because he had the answers, but because he had lived the questions. The world Oppenheimer helped to usher in remained haunted by the atom. Nuclear weapons proliferated in the decades after his death, defying his hopes for restraint. The arms race he had once tried to slow only intensified before it began to recede. Yet the very urgency of disarmament, the rise of non-proliferation treaties, and the global dialogues around deterrence were, in part, echoes of his warnings. His legacy was not solely bound to what was built, but to what was resisted. In 2022, more than half a century after his death, the U.S. government formally vacated the decision to revoke his security clearance, calling it a flawed process that had failed to uphold justice. The move was largely symbolic, but affirmed what many had long believed, that Robert Oppenheimer had been wronged. It was a late recognition, but a meaningful one, adding a coda of dignity to a life marked by brilliance and burden. Oppenheimer's legacy does not offer easy conclusions. It is neither redemption nor condemnation, but reflection. He was not a martyr, nor a monster, but a man who bore the weight of a world he helped to create. In the silence left by his passing, the questions he posed remain. What does it mean to know something so powerful that it cannot be unknown? And how does one live having glimpsed the abyss and helped shape its edge?